Good morning, everyone. Happy Tuesday morning to you. Welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. Hey, we are in the midst of summarizing what we have been examining over the last several months about the Olivet Discourse and specifically Matthew 25, 1 to 13. And here's the deal. If it is true that Matthew chapter 25, 1 to 13, the parable of the coming of the Son of Man for the wedding, if that has to do with the fulfillment of God's Old Covenant promises made to Old Covenant Israel, okay, if that's true, then if the fulfillment of Matthew 25, 1 to 13 is still future, then that means that Old Covenant Israel remains as God's covenant people today. Now that's really problematic for the amillennial and the postmillennial view, which claims that God was through with Israel at the cross. Well, if God was through with Israel at the cross, as I have asked countless people in informal and formal debates, if God was through with Old Covenant Israel at the cross, how is it that the New Testament writers were looking for the imminent fulfillment of God's Old Covenant promises made to Israel? I thought she ceased to be his covenant people at the cross. I thought the Old Covenant, with all of those promises, I thought that was nailed to the cross. Just recently on Facebook, have to take note of this, one Church of Christ minister just assailed me repeatedly, I'm a false teacher, heretic, I don't know how to formulate an argument, etc., etc. And yet the strange thing about it is, I have posted now at least 3 different times the very question that I just posed here. And that question is, to repeat, if God was through with Israel at the cross, if the law of Moses was nailed to the cross, as this gentleman keeps insisting, then how could Paul in Colossians chapter 2, 16 and 17 say that the new moons, the feast days, and the Sabbath days were, when he wrote in approximately 61, 62 AD, still shadows of the good things that had not yet, but were about to come? How can he do that? That means the feast days were still typological. It means the feast days were not fulfilled. It means that, Exodus and Leviticus and the book of Numbers, all of which discuss those feast days, is still valid, still typological, still applicable, still in force. Now, like I said, I've asked this gentleman no less than 3 times to answer the question. Well, strangely enough, he just sort of kind of disappears when I pose this question. Sometimes he disappears literally for months on end and then pops back up raising new subjects, wanting to discuss different subjects. Well, little wonder. Look, I used to believe exactly like he does until I discovered I was wrong and I had to change. So this entire issue of the wedding is so critical. If the promise of the coming of the Lord for the wedding in Matthew 25, 1 to 13 has not been fulfilled, then the old law, every jot, every tittle of the old law remains valid, binding, and applicable. If the old law has been removed, if Jesus did in fact fulfill the law and the prophets, then guess what? The wedding has taken place and the Lord has come. And that means, guess what? Matthew 25, 1 to 13 does not apply to our future. It belongs to AD 70. In Matthew 24, remember, 29 to 31, we have the shout, the sound of the trumpet, the gathering of the elect. Well, the gathering of the elect is the wedding, folks. Hello? So, what I have been trying to emphasize for you is how absolutely critically important it is to place Matthew 25, 1 to 13 within its proper prophetic perspective and framework. And that framework is not some imaginary end of time. It is not some imaginary wedding between Christ and the church, divorced from Israel, unrelated to the fulfillment of God's promises to Old Covenant Israel. No. Has nothing whatsoever to do with the futurist application. The futurist application falls to the ground. The futurist division of the Olivet Discourse falls to the ground when we see that Matthew 25, 1 to 13 is Jesus' discussion of the fulfillment of God's Old Covenant promises made to Old Covenant Israel. Now look, I'm not alone on this, you understand. Scholars who are not preterists understand that Matthew chapter 25 is about God returning to marry Israel. N.T. Wright takes that view. And he's not alone. And so when I say that it is critical to understand these connections, to connect all of the dots between these Old Covenant promises of God's remarriage to Israel and all of these New Testament prophecies that speak of the wedding, Matthew 22, Luke 14, Revelation 21. Folks, this is not a new subject. Jesus did not invent a new doctrine of a wedding. He came to fulfill the law and the prophets. Now, very quickly, to close today's summary, let me drive home a point that I made earlier. In Isaiah chapter 62, the Lord speaking of that coming time in which He would remarry not just the 10 tribes. You see, this is critical. It's not just the remarriage of the 10 tribes. Now, this is the glorification, the restoration of Jerusalem and Zion as well. That means this is all about the kingdom. This is all about the last days. This is all about the ultimate salvation. And what does the Lord say? That at that time, when all Israel would be restored, verse 2, the Gentiles shall see your righteousness, all kings your glory. You shall be called by a new name, which the mouth of the Lord will name. You shall also be a crown of glory in the hand of the Lord, and a royal diadem in the hand of your God. You shall no longer be termed forsaken. You see, that term forsaken was no longer, or was not just applicable to the 10 tribes. It came to be applied to Judah and Benjamin when the Lord would depart from them as well. Jeremiah chapter 23, 41 and following. The Lord said, I'm going to forsake you, and you're going to be an everlasting curse. But I have to move on. You shall no longer be termed forsaken, nor shall your land any more be termed desolate. You shall be called Hephzibah, rejoicing, and your land Beulah, which means married. So at the time of the coming of the Lord for the calling of the Gentiles, God would remarry Israel, the whole house of Israel. But you see, God couldn't remarry Judah until Shiloh came, until Messiah came, and until Judah, the harlot wife, was herself slain as a national kingdom, and then all 12 tribes restored, the righteous remnant of all 12 tribes, restored spiritually under Messiah in the wedding. Okay, now watch. the Lord makes this promise that this is the restoration of all 12 tribes. And I'm going to skip down to verse 11. Indeed, the Lord has proclaimed to the end of the world, say to the daughter of Zion. See, once again, this is not just the 10 tribes. This is all 12 tribes. Surely your salvation is coming. Behold, his reward is with him. Now look, folks, do not miss this. This promise and prophecy of the coming of the Lord with salvation is the reiteration of chapter 40. And John the Baptizer was the voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare ye the way of the Lord who is coming with his salvation at the time of judgment. Who was the voice of one crying in the wilderness? Well, it was John the Baptizer. So we know when this time of salvation, thus this time of the remarriage, was supposed to be. And John the Baptizer, when he announced, he said, the kingdom of heaven is drawn near. What is the kingdom? Oh, it's the time of the remarriage. Now notice, not only is Isaiah 62 the reiteration of chapter 40, but in Matthew 16, 27 and 28, Jesus said, the Son of Man will come in the glory of the Father with his angels and shall reward every man according to his works. Hello. He's reiterating the promise that John the Baptizer made about the coming day of the Lord to bring salvation. And now what did Jesus say in Matthew 16, 27 and 28? And verily I say unto you, there are some standing here which shall not taste of death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. That's the coming of the Lord for the kingdom of Isaiah 62. It's the coming of the Lord for the time of the reward of Isaiah chapter 40, 1 through 12. That John the Baptizer said that time had drawn near and the time of judgment had drawn near because this Lord, the one that would bring the reward, the one that would bring the kingdom, his winnowing fork is already in his hands. That was said 2,000 years ago. And Jesus emphatically said, there are some standing here which shall not taste of death until they see the Son of Man coming. Coming for what? To reward every man in fulfillment of Isaiah 40, in fulfillment of Isaiah 62, which is the promise of the remarriage. The remarriage of Matthew chapter 25. That means that the marriage of Matthew 25, at the coming of the Lord of Matthew 25, was to be in the first century generation, and that means that Matthew chapter 25 is not different from Matthew 24, 4 to 36. It means that means that the Olivet Discourse is one united discourse about one subject, the end of the Old Covenant age and the marriage. I'm out of time. Okay, we got more. Look, I may just take this week for summary because it's so critical to have all of this information in our heads, in our minds, so that we understand these concepts. So, thank you for joining me. I will see you on the flip side.